I am Amir Weiner, the director of CRIS, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker and dear friend, Francine Hirsch, the WWII's Distinguished Achievement Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Hirsch is the author of the highly acclaimed Empire of Nations, a brilliant analysis of the Soviet nationality policies during the interwar years, a book that instantly established itself as the standard account of this important topic and accordingly won numerous prizes. Today, Professor Hirsch will present us with her most recent book on the unique and controversial role of the Soviets in shaping the War Crime Tribunal in Nuremberg in 1945-1946, a crucial topic that stood at the center of post-war international politics, human rights, and the evolution of international law. And in line with the recognition of Professor Hirsch's achievements, the book has already won a Special Merit Award from the American Society of International Law. Following Professor Hirsch's presentation, we'll open the floor for questions and answer. And please type your questions and answer app, and we will transmit them to Professor Hirsch, who will answer. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really just so happy to be here today. I'd like to say thanks Stanford Center for Russian and East European and Eurasian Studies and Amir for having me and for that lovely introduction. I'm very grateful to Amir just for taking an interest in my work over all these years. I spent a wonderful year at Stanford back in the early 2000s, and if I really try, I can still smell the eucalyptus. Well, today I'll be presenting an overview of my book and outlining 4 of its main arguments. Along the way, I'll also do 2 short readings, and then at the very end, I'll share some images. All right, so here we go. The International Military Tribunal, or IMT, took place from November 1945 to October 1946 at the Palace of Justice in occupied Germany. This was the first of the Nuremberg trials, and it would turn out to be the only 4-power one. The United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, the 4 major Allied powers, tried 22 former Nazi leaders, including Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. They also tried 6 Nazi organizations, including the Gestapo and the SS. And we're now in the midst of marking Nuremberg's 75th anniversary year. I want to begin today, though, by taking us back to the summer of 1945, the summer before the Nuremberg trials, by reading a passage from chapter 2 of the book. And in this passage, American, British, French, and Soviet representatives are about to meet in London to negotiate the IMT's framework, to put together what would soon be called the London Agreement and the Nuremberg Charter. Robert H. Jackson, the US Associate Supreme Court Justice, will represent the United States in these discussions and then in the IMT. And to put it mildly, he's less than thrilled to be cooperating with the Soviets. Okay, so here we go. Robert H. Jackson would have liked nothing more than to move forward without the Soviets, whom he was already regarding as the Achilles heel of the entire plan for a 4-power tribunal. He was learning more by the day from the OSS and other intelligence sources about Soviet actions during the war. At a June 11th meeting with American religious leaders, Jackson had shared his anxiety about potential problems arising during the trial as a result of the Soviet Union's invasions of Poland and Finland in 1939. The Soviet Union could not exactly be uninvited or excluded from participating in the prosecution of the former Nazi leaders. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had been the first to propose an international tribunal, and the Soviet lawyer, Aron Trainin, had provided key arguments about the Nazi conspiracy and about the illegality of aggressive war. But Jackson worried. He worried that the Soviets would undermine the tribunal's legitimacy just by participating, and he was beginning to ponder ways of minimizing their impact. It would be so much easier if they simply didn't show up. The Soviets had no intention of not showing up. In June 1945, Soviet leaders were still gaining a full realization of what their country had endured during the war. The Soviet Union's losses were almost beyond belief. Some 27 million Soviet citizens had perished. That's 1 out of every 7 people. 2/3 of the dead were civilians. The world did not seem to grasp the sheer magnitude of Soviet losses. An international tribunal would provide the Soviets with a public forum for a reckoning. It would expose Nazi crimes and, Soviet leaders believed, would facilitate Moscow's claims for material compensation and German labor for reparations. The stakes for the Soviet Union were thus extremely high. Okay, so that's the reading. And of course, the Soviets did show up in London, and they then went on to play a critical role at Nuremberg. But in the United States, Nuremberg has been remembered chiefly as an American story. In the most popular accounts, Jackson is the hero of the moment, and the TV docudrama Nuremberg, which some of you may have seen, is actually a really great example of this. Jackson, played by a young Alec Baldwin, is the driving force in this film behind the entire trial. The British and the French, they play noble but supporting roles. The Soviets, meanwhile, they come off as brutish and vengeful, and in some scenes as no better than the Nazi defendants. This version of the Nuremberg story has persisted for decades in different variations, and the Soviet contribution in particular has gone largely unappreciated. Now, there are several reasons for this, including limited access to the former Soviet archives, especially during the Cold War. And there's also the fact that the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, including the Einsatzgruppen trial and the judge's trial, were carried out by the United States alone. But I would suggest that there's also a deeper issue here at play, a discomfort with historical complexity. Because the Soviet role in the Nuremberg trials, it was complicated. The Soviets were carrying out deportations in Poland and in Hungary, even as the IMT was hearing evidence against the Nazis. There were episodes involving the Soviets at Nuremberg that everyone wanted to forget, such as the Soviet effort to use the IMT to blame one of their own war crimes, the Katina massacre of thousands of Polish officers who were prisoners of war, to blame that on the Nazis. In a more general sense, too, the contribution of Stalin's Soviet Union to the IMT upends the myth of Nuremberg as fully grounded in liberal ideas about justice and the law. I argue that we need the full story. The real Nuremberg story is messy. It's also, I think, incredibly interesting, and it is necessary because Nuremberg still matters. For some, it remains a kind of gold standard of international justice, right? For others, it's an appalling example of victor's justice that should never be repeated. But if Nuremberg is going to offer meaningful lessons at all, we need to understand what actually happened. So my book, it aims to bring the Soviets fully into the picture, and it draws on evidence from 5 Moscow archives to do so. These materials include protocols of the meetings of 2 secret Soviet Nuremberg commissions. It includes secret telegrams from Nuremberg to Moscow and back, and these were mostly from the archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It includes letters, diaries, surveillance reports from Soviet writers, artists, editors, and diplomats that give us a sense of the day-to-day life in Nuremberg of the members of the Soviet delegation, their impressions of the city, the food, the nightlife, the defendants, right? It also includes lists of possible witnesses and their depositions, and it includes marked up copies of the indictment and the judgment and other documents that the Soviets secretly smuggled back to Moscow for review and approval. We see the tremendous Soviet contribution to the trials, but we also see the many ways in which Soviet participation did threaten to undermine the legitimacy of the IMT, right? What Jackson had been concerned about. The book also aims to use the Soviet piece and the Soviet archives, combined with other sources, to tell a richer story of the Nuremberg trials as a whole. Looking at the relationship among all 4 powers really opens things up. There were 4 prosecution teams at Nuremberg: American, British, Soviet, and French. There were 4 main judges, one representing each country of the prosecution. The relationships among the prosecutors and among the judges and between the prosecutors and the judges are highly revealing. We see clashes about the meaning of justice and compromises made on all sides. We see the importance of the nightlife and the parties with an endless flow of alcohol for keeping things congenial and sometimes for keeping the trials on track. We see too how Nuremberg became an early front of the Cold War and how this, to take things back around, affected the telling of the Nuremberg story. All right, let me just say a bit about the narrative arc of the book. The book starts during the darkest days of the war. It covers the road to Nuremberg, focusing on the contentious negotiations about the Nuremberg Charter and about the indictment, which set out the charges. It then retells the story of the trials, capturing the drama of the prosecution's case, the defense case, and the judgment, which, to the dismay of the Soviets, resulted in several acquittals. It ends with a chapter on Nuremberg's aftermath, looking at its legacy in the post-war period. My aim with this book was really to tell a good story and also to introduce readers, especially American readers, to a new cast of characters. We see Nuremberg and the trials through the eyes of the playwright Vsevolod Vishnevsky, the political cartoonist Boris Efimov, the Soviet documentary filmmaker Roman Karman, and other Soviet correspondents. Some, like Karman, had been embedded with the Red Army during the war and had witnessed the liberation of the concentration camps. We also see the Soviets, the Americans, the French, and the British getting to know one another. And here, Jackson's unpublished diaries at the Library of Congress are full of sharp observations. And Jackson had judged one dinner that he hosted at Claridge's in London during that summer of 1945 to have been, and I'll quote here, to have been very successful from the point of view of cultivating better relations, even as he noted that the Soviets drank very little and were somewhat scornful of the yellow liquid claimed to be vodka which was served. We also see the outsized role of Andrei Vyshinsky, deputy foreign minister and the head of one of the Soviet Union's secret Nuremberg commissions. Vyshinsky had earlier been chief prosecutor in the Moscow trials of 1936 to 1938, major show trials which Stalin had used to take down his political enemies. And although Vyshinsky spent just 1 week in Nuremberg, which we'll return to, his influence was a constant for the Soviet delegation. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to the book's 4 main arguments and take you through them. Okay. Argument 1. Without the Soviets, Nuremberg likely never would have happened. The Soviets took up the question of Nazi criminality early in the war, prompted by the sheer brutality of the Nazi assault and the Nazi occupation. In April 1942, Foreign Minister Molotov published his 3rd note on German atrocities, citing evidence that the burning of villages and the massacre of civilians were part of a deliberate German plan. That same month, Soviet leaders asked the Academy of Sciences Institute of Law, based in Moscow, to evaluate the international law perspective on reparations. 6 months later, in October 1942, Molotov publicly called for the convening of what he called a special international tribunal and invited all interested governments to cooperate in bringing Hitler, Goering, Hess, and other Nazi leaders to justice. The United States and Britain were slow to come on board. The US government worried about reprisals against Allied prisoners of war. The British argued that the crimes of the Nazi leaders were far too serious for any kind of trial and pushed instead for punishment by executive decree. The Soviets, well, they went down their own path. They created their own War Crimes Commission, the Extraordinary State Commission, and they were then the only Allied power that did not participate in the United Nations War Crimes Commission, the UNWCC, which met in London starting in October 1943. But even as the Soviets went down their own path, the Soviet jurist Aron Trainin from Moscow's Institute of Law influenced the international discussion about war crimes through his writings. Trainin argued that the planning and waging of wars of aggression, wars of conquest, should be punished as crimes against peace. He also argued that Nazi leaders could and should be tried for participating in a criminal conspiracy. And he challenged the defense of just following orders, the defense of superior orders. Okay. Trainin initially set out his ideas in a report for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, actually in response to Molotov's request to research the international law perspective on reparations. This report was turned into a book, The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites. And I actually got to see drafts of the report and transcripts of the discussions about the report in the archive of the Academy of Sciences. I was then able to trace the book's journey. The book made its way across Europe to London, where it was translated into English and discussed in the meetings of the UNWCC. It then crossed the Atlantic to the United States, where it landed at the War Department Special Projects Branch and also at the White House. Now, Trainin was not the only lawyer arguing for the criminality of aggressive war, right? This was in the air at the time. But whereas many European and American lawyers expressed unease about ex post facto or retroactive law, the Soviets had no such reservations. After the victory, when the other Allied powers came around to the idea of an international tribunal, Trainin was one of the 2 representatives that the Soviets sent to London to negotiate the Nuremberg Charter. Crimes against peace, Trainin's term, right, was one of the 3 categories of crimes set out in the Charter's Article 6, along with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Okay, so that's argument 1. We'll move on to argument 2. Argument 2. The Soviets had no idea what they had set in motion and were greatly handicapped on the international stage by the constraints of Stalinism. The Soviets took Nazi guilt as a given and were expecting guilty verdicts along with hangings down the line. They aimed to use the IMT to demonstrate Nazi guilt and to tell a story about Soviet suffering and Soviet heroism. Soviet expectations and aims shaped their choice of personnel for Nuremberg. Almost all members of the Soviet legal team were connected to the Soviet show trials of the 1930s and had no experience with Western style trials or with what we would consider to be cross-examination. The Soviet judge, Yona Nikitchenko, had been a judge in the Moscow trials. The Soviet prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, had served as a prosecutor for show trials in the 1930s in Ukraine. And Soviet assistant prosecutors all had pretty much similar credentials, most of them. The Soviets thought that the victors would control the script, just as the prosecution had done in the Moscow trials and in the Soviet Union's own war crime trials up until that point. They certainly didn't expect the defendants to be allowed to take the stand in their own defense or to be allowed to call witnesses. They were so confident of the victors controlling the script that they insisted on including the Katina massacre in the indictment as a German war crime. Now, Soviet insistence on this seems reckless, right, in retrospect, but the Soviets really believed that the defendants wouldn't be allowed to challenge their evidence or to make counter accusations. The Soviets were so confident, too, of the victors controlling the script that they initially didn't bother to tell their chief prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, about the secret protocols to the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, in which Hitler and Stalin had plotted out the conquest and division of Poland and the Baltic states. They assumed that Rudenko didn't need to know, even though Ribbentrop, the former German foreign minister who had signed this pact, was one of the defendants. The secret protocols became an issue at the very start of the trials in November 1945, prompting Andrei Vyshinsky's one and only visit to Nuremberg. And I'm going to actually do my second reading now, which is from chapter 5, to give you a sense of Vyshinsky's visit and what was at stake. And it's important to remember here that the Western powers don't know about Wyszynski's secret commission. They don't know the Soviets have these secret commissions. And Wyszynski is visiting Nuremberg in his capacity as deputy foreign minister, right, as a distinguished guest. Okay, here we go. On Sunday, November 25th, Andrei Wyszynski came to town. His arrival created a state of heightened alert among the members of the Soviet delegation. The Soviet prosecutors and judges all knew that they were in Nuremberg to do Wyszynski's bidding and that their fates rested in his hands. Even the Western prosecutors were stirred up. According to U.S. Assistant Prosecutor Telford Taylor, the U.S. delegation had regarded Wyszynski as an ominous figure because of his role in the Moscow trials. Everyone eyed him with curiosity. What exactly was his business? How would he behave? Wyszynski had come to Nuremberg primarily to ensure that the Soviet prosecution successfully repelled a push for the tribunal to consider highly sensitive evidence about the German-Soviet non-aggression pact. The instigator of this request was Alfred Seidel, the defense attorney for Hans Frank and a former member of the Nazi Party who claimed to have dug up some documents about the pact's secret protocols. The evening after his arrival, Wyszynski called a meeting with the members of the Soviet delegation. Many issues were discussed. At the end of the meeting, Wyszynski broached the most sensitive topic of all, a request made by Jackson. A few weeks earlier, Jackson had asked his British, French, and Soviet colleagues to write up secret memoranda detailing their country's war crimes in anticipation of potential allegations from the defense. Back in Moscow, Soviet leaders had put their own spin on Jackson's request. Without admitting to any wrongdoing, they had made a list of taboo topics that they wanted kept out of the courtroom. Wyszynski now presented this list to the Soviet delegation. Not surprisingly, this highly secret list, which had been typed out on a single sheet of paper, included a number of items about Soviet-German relations, including the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 and all questions relating to it, Molotov's visit to Berlin, Ribbentrop's visit to Moscow. It also included general topics such as Soviet-Polish relations. Wyszynski now ordered Rudenko to reach a verbal agreement with the French, British, and American prosecutors to steer clear of questions that their countries did not want raised by the accused. Notably, Wyszynski did not give Rudenko permission to share a physical copy of the Soviet taboo list with any of the Western prosecutors. Once a copy was in circulation, the Soviets would lose the shield of plausible deniability. Wyszynski's visit was an occasion, even to those who were unaware of his direct involvement with the trials and only knew him as a Soviet dignitary. Jackson gave a dinner at the Grand Hotel in his honor. Wyszynski went there directly from his meeting with the Soviet delegation. At one point in the evening, Wyszynski rose and proposed a toast to the defendants. May their paths lead straight from the courthouse to the grave. Everyone had drained their glasses before the translation was finished, and the American judges were appalled to hear that they had drunk to the deaths of the accused. This was perhaps the only time the Soviets did not mind the sluggish pace of interpretation from Russian into English. Wyszynski visibly enjoyed the moment. Okay, well, that's one of my favorite scenes from the book. I love the drama of the story, but I also think that it beautifully illustrates the ways in which Stalinism left the Soviet delegation unprepared for the international stage. We see the primacy put on secrecy right before and during the trials. We see the problems with translation and interpretation. Right? The fact was that the Soviet delegation did not have enough able interpreters or translators in Nuremberg for a number of reasons. Many German speakers had been arrested and shot during the Stalinist terror. There was also the fact that the Soviet Union's Ministry of Internal Affairs was reluctant to clear people who knew any foreign languages for travel abroad. We also see in this scene Moscow's expectations for centralized control. Moscow's demand for centralized control was an issue for the entire course of the trials. And I'll just linger a bit here because I think this is really important. The Soviet prosecutors and judges had much less independence than their American, British, and French counterparts. Vyshinsky and a secret commission, which included the heads of all the branches of the Soviet security apparatus, were supposed to oversee the Soviet delegation and the Soviet case from afar. Rudenko, the Soviet chief prosecutor, and Nikitchenko, the judge, had to clear each and every decision with Soviet leaders. They smuggled documents through secret channels, often via Berlin, to Vyshinsky and his commission in Moscow. Vyshinsky then sent them further up the chain of command to Molotov and sometimes to Stalin. The paper trail that this produced is just an amazing source for the historian. The Moscow archives have marked up drafts of the indictment, the judgment, and other documents. And it's just worth mentioning here that drafts of the judgment were not supposed to circulate at all. Some of the American literature about the trial, they make a whole big deal out of the fact that the judges were confined to a room and the trash was burned every night, but Nikitchenko managed to get a copy out into Moscow. All right. But what's great for the historian in terms of this incredible paper trail and all of these documents going back and forth and working their way up the chain of command in Moscow, this was actually terrible for the Soviet delegation in Nuremberg. Sending documents to Moscow and back through secret channels was a nightmare. Documents were sometimes lost in transit. Instructions, directives often arrived too late to be of real use, and Nikitchenko and Rudenko were often left scrambling. Okay. Argument 3, on to argument 3. At Nuremberg, the Soviets presented powerful proof of what we now know as the Holocaust, and what was talked about at the time as Hitler's final solution. Now, this Soviet contribution is often overlooked, in part because earlier Soviet war crimes trials, like the Kharkov trial of December 1943, spoke of crimes against peaceful Soviet citizens, even when the victims were Jews. It gets overlooked in part because of the Soviet Union's anti-Semitic, anti-cosmopolitan campaign that was launched in the years after Nuremberg. But at Nuremberg, the Soviet presentations on crimes against humanity included extensive evidence of the Nazi plan to exterminate Europe's Jews. Assistant prosecutor Lev Smirnov introduced shocking documents, including a report from the commanders of Einsatzgruppe A, Death Squad A, bragging about having fulfilled orders, and I'll quote here, to eliminate the Jews to the fullest possible extent in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, including a Polish government report stating that 3 million Jews had been exterminated in Poland. Eyewitnesses for the Soviet prosecution also testified about the Nazi campaign to wipe out the Jews. Now, the Soviets almost didn't send eyewitnesses to Nuremberg. The Soviet security police had been screening possible witnesses for the Soviet prosecution since November 1945. But Soviet leaders had been themselves considering having the Soviet prosecution build its case on documents alone. But the Soviets, so they changed along the way. The Soviet prosecution presented its case last, after the Americans, the British, and the French. And while the Soviets struggled at Nuremberg for some of the reasons just discussed, they also adapted and made course corrections along the way. They made the decision to send witnesses in January 1946, when Rudenko was back in Moscow for the holiday break, meeting with Soviet leaders, including Stalin. The Soviet prosecution ultimately sent 10. They ultimately called 7 eyewitnesses to testify about Nazi war crimes and crimes against humanity. 2 of those eyewitnesses, Avraham Tsutsgover and Samuel Rajman, were selected specifically to testify about Nazi crimes against the Jews. Tsutsgover, a Yiddish poet, had fled the Vilna ghetto in September 1943 and joined a group of partisans in the forests of northwestern Belarusia. In March 1944, the Soviets had staged a rescue operation, airlifting him and his wife Fredka out of German-occupied territory. In Moscow, Tsutsgover worked with the writer Ilya Ehrenberg and other members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee to compile evidence of the Nazi murder of Jews throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The Soviets called Tsutsgover to the witness box in late February 1946. His testimony was harrowing. He spoke about the Einsatzgruppen and the systematic killing of Jews in Vilna. He also recounted the murder of his newborn son by German soldiers in the ghetto hospital. Tsutsgover was the only witness to remain standing in the witness box, as if he wrote in his diary, it had been a matter of saying Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. He considered it a matter of Jewish destiny, he wrote, that he, a Yiddish poet, had survived to judge Rosenberg and Frank in Nuremberg, and through them, all who had adhered to their ideology. Tsutsgover, a Jew and a partisan, understood that he was speaking on behalf of the Jewish people and on behalf of the Soviet people. His testimony was critical for the Soviets, as was the evidence presented by Lev Smirnov. They told the story of the annihilation of the Jews, while also integrating it into a larger narrative about the wartime suffering of the entire Soviet people in the German-occupied East. Okay. Argument 4. The Nuremberg trials became an early front of the Cold War, and understanding Nuremberg as such gives us an important perspective on the post-war movement for human rights. While we tend to think about Nuremberg as a struggle between the prosecution and the defense, right, the courtroom drama, it was also a contest among the countries of the prosecution for power and influence and control over the narrative of the war. The Soviets and the Americans in particular were on a collision course here from the start. Now, the prosecution presented its case from November 1945 through February 1946. And tensions among the four powers were mostly kept under wraps, even as Jackson did what he could to extend American influence over as much of the case as possible. Then, in March 1946, the Cold War blew into the Nuremberg courtroom. On March 5th, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech, as we now call it, in Fulton, Missouri, calling for Anglo-American resistance to Soviet tyranny. The very next day, the defense case began. When the Soviets got to the courtroom in the morning, there were copies of the US Army newspaper, Stars and Stripes, scattered everywhere, with the headline, "Unite to Stop Russians." The defense attorneys, they were holding up copies of the newspapers for their clients to read over their shoulders. Now, all of this energized the defense, who upped their effort to drive a wedge between the Soviets and the Western powers. And the defense had great success in the weeks and months that followed. Goering insisted that Germany had launched a preventive war against the Soviet Union and not a war of aggression. Ribbentrop riveted the courtroom with his description of the secret protocols to the German-Soviet non-aggression pact. He suggested that if Germany was guilty of crimes against peace, then the Soviet Union was too. One Soviet informant, writing home after Ribbentrop's testimony, expressed alarm that, and I'll quote him here, that the Soviet Union, a country of victors, had gone to Nuremberg to prosecute the fascists and had instead become the object of their provocative attacks. This turn of events made absolutely no sense to him. And in fact, it had taken the entire Soviet delegation by surprise. The prosecutors, they had agreed early on Jackson's initiative to work together to keep, awkward topics, right, about their own country's own war crimes out of the courtroom. And the Soviets referred to this as their gentleman's agreement. But this is significant now. The Soviets had not understood that the Western judges had not signed on to this. The Western judges were deeply worried about allegations of victor's justice and about preserving the legitimacy of the trials. And Wyszynski's toast didn't exactly help things here. The Western judges ended up giving significant leeway to the defendants, more than any of the prosecutors, including Jackson, had expected. The challenges to the Soviets kept coming Goering's attorney petitioned for witnesses to counter Soviet charges that German forces had carried out the Katyn massacre. And the Western judges, outvoting Nikitchenko, allowed 3 defense witnesses and 3 Soviet witnesses to testify about Katyn. The defense witnesses ultimately cast enough doubt on the Soviet version of events that no mention of Katyn appeared in the judgment. Now, the after-hour socializing, including tennis and pool parties as the weather grew warmer, prevented things in Nuremberg from completely falling apart. But back in Moscow, Soviet leaders interpreted all decisions by the judges that went against their interests after that, and there were many 3-to-1 votes against Nikitchenko as part of an Anglo-American anti-Soviet plot. In the end, Nuremberg was a disappointment for the Soviets, who never expected their own actions to be subject to scrutiny and who were expecting guilty verdicts and hangings down the line. They didn't get all the verdicts and sentences they wanted. 12 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. 3 were acquitted. The others, including Hess, received prison sentences. Notably, the Soviets themselves, they still wanted more four-power trials, especially of the industrialists who had financed Hitler. Many of them were in American custody. But the Americans were done with the Soviets after Nuremberg and held the subsequent Nuremberg trials on their own. And in fact, all of 4 powers, they had been holding national war crimes trials and would continue to do so as well, too. Okay. As a result of Nuremberg, the Cold War and the post-war movement for human rights became completely entangled. This in turn shaped and for a long time hampered subsequent deliberations in the United Nations and other institutions about turning the Nuremberg Principles, as they soon came to be called, and which included crimes against peace and crimes against humanity, into permanent international law and creating a permanent international court. Okay, so I'm gonna conclude in a second. Okay. So I want to conclude today by reflecting a bit on Nuremberg's legacy, and I'll just say that for any of those main arguments or points, I'll be happy to answer more questions about them or go into more detail in the Q&A. Okay, so Nuremberg's legacy. I worry sometimes that I'm telling a story that people might not want to hear. The Hollywood version of the Nuremberg story is uplifting after all. And Russia has its own version of the Nuremberg story, simplified in its own way, that naturally does not include Katyn or talk very much about the secret protocols, right? But I think that the more expansive Nuremberg story offers important lessons about the perils, as well as the possibilities of international cooperation. The IMT was not simply a result of Western leadership and liberal idealism, right? That's a nice story, but that's not the case. It involved endless negotiations and very difficult compromises by representatives of 4 governments that had had very different experiences of the war and had very different ideas, in some cases, about justice. And yes, the Cold War politicization of human rights, that too is part of the Nuremberg story, and it helps explain why the promise of the Nuremberg Principles has fallen short. The end of the Cold War did eventually see the founding of the International Criminal Court, but a number of powerful nations, including the United States and Russia, have regarded it and continue to regard it with suspicion or outright disdain. Concerns about the politicization of justice and about preserving state sovereignty continue to this day. But Nuremberg itself was a tremendous success story. Representatives from the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, they managed to find common ground, even as early Cold War tensions flared. They created a comprehensive record of the crimes of the Third Reich and pushed forward the work of denazification. They set the precedent that launching a war of aggression was a criminally punishable act. And they sparked an international conversation about human rights, about genocide, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, an important conversation that, despite its ups and downs, right, continues to this day. An international legal system, or really international institutions of any kind, do not necessarily require governments to have the same ideals, right? Although that certainly helps. But they do require governments to believe that they have something to gain by participating. That was the case at Nuremberg. Now, during this 75th anniversary year of the IMT, as America re-engages with the world and rejoins international institutions with the aim of tackling problems that threaten all of humanity, the real and very messy story of Nuremberg, the achievements and the compromises, the highs and the lows, the courtroom scenes and behind the scenes, all of this deserve a thorough consideration. Thank you so much. I'm gonna do a little slideshow show and tell now. Let me see if I can get this up here. And so what I'm going to suggest is that if people want to, if you all have questions, to put your questions, this could give you some time to put your questions in, and I can just show you some images. So just here we have a picture. Nuremberg was in the American zone, and here's a picture of what the city looked like in the fall of 1945. Here we have an aerial shot of the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. And so you see the main building and what looks like these wings coming off of it in the back. That was the Nuremberg prison. And so the prison itself was attached to the building with the courtroom. Here's the entrance to the Palace of Justice. I love this image with the flags of the 4 countries. It's a variation on that image I used for the cover of the book. Here we have the defendants in the courtroom. Here's Robert H. Jackson and Alec Baldwin as Robert H. Jackson. And they must have used this pose for that cover. Okay, that's the political cartoonist Boris Efimov that I mentioned. And here are a couple of his caricatures, the one of Goering and Ribbentrop. And they were published in a series in the Soviet newspaper Izvestia in December 1945. And that series was called Fascist Beasts. And again, Efimov has these memoirs of Nuremberg that if you read Russian are really just amazing to read. His impressions of what was happening in the courtroom day by day, but also his memories of going back to the war. It's really powerful, and kind of combined with his description of how he's drawing in the courtroom, and then you see the actual images. Here's the photo of the Grand Hotel, the same Grand Hotel where Andrei Vyshinsky gave that toast. And here are some members of the Soviet delegation. These are Soviet correspondents posing with an American guard. Fourth from left, we have Vsevolod Vishnevsky, and then we have, no, I'm sorry, Roman Carmen is, I'm saying which direction I'm looking from. Roman Carmen is fourth from left, and Vishnevsky is second from left. Okay. Here's in the upper left, there's a wartime photo of Roman Carmen. And then the way on the furthest right is a photo of Roman Carmen. And I wish I could talk with all of you now back and forth and have you guess what's going on in this photo. But what's going on in this photo is that the Soviet correspondents are at a soccer game. And I love this photo, especially when you look at it combined with other images, because it just always reminds me that Nuremberg was partly about the courtroom, but it was partly about this experience of these members of the Soviet delegation who they hadn't traveled much abroad. Some of them had traveled abroad, but others hadn't traveled much abroad. And just like what day-to-day life was and their interactions with people from all over the world, I find that very interesting. Here's a photo of Andrei Vyshinsky, and I just included this English language report of the court proceedings of the Trotskyite Zinovyevite Terror Center. That's of the first of the Moscow trials. And that's what he was well known for, even in the West at the time of the Nuremberg trials. Okay, here we have, this is from the London conference, and Aaron Trainin is in the middle, kind of straight on with the mustache. Sitting to his right, the other Soviet representative to the London conference was actually Yona Nikitchenko, who everyone assumed was going to be the Soviet prosecutor. And then Stalin kind of pulled a fast one and decided that Nikitchenko would actually be the judge and replaced him with Rudenko. But here at the London conference, again, they're there together, and to Trainin's left is the interpreter Oleg Trainovsky. Here we've got Rudenko and Nikitchenko in Nuremberg. And I love this one. This is with his hand kind of leaning in. That's Andrei Vyshinsky watching their trial, taking it in. This is another one of my favorite photos. We have, there's Roman Rudenko with his hand resting in his head, and Yuri Pokrovsky, the Soviet deputy chief prosecutor, is sitting across from him, taking some notes. And this was taken while the Americans were presenting their case. And sometimes I look at these photos like, what were they thinking right now? Like, what is going on? Here's Avraham Tsutsgover giving testimony, again, the only witness to remain standing in the witness box. This is that Stars and Stripes newspaper, Unite to Stop Russians, Churchill warns at Fulton. And again, copies of these were strewn about. And there's a wonderful memoir by Arkady Polcharak, who was part of the Soviet delegation in Nuremberg. And he's one of the people who talks about what it was like to arrive in the courtroom that next day and see those newspapers everywhere. Here's Goering in the witness box. And then finally, Andrei Vyshinsky, years later, well, not that far later, at the United Nations. Vyshinsky, then, one of the things I do in the book is trace what happens to the members of the different delegations and all the key figures after Nuremberg. And Vyshinsky goes on to play an active role in the United Nations and becomes the Soviet Union's permanent representative after Stalin's death. This photo is taken in April 1954 when he's the president of the UN Security Council, and he'll die later in that year. All right, so that's the end of my show and tell part of today. And let me see now, if I can, here we go, stop share. All right, and I'm happy to chat and take questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Fran, for the fantastic presentation. We have a large number of questions, and I will lump some of them together. So we'll start with Michael Herzen, who has several questions, starting with the shower praise on your excellent book. And the first question, the representation of Vyshinsky makes him seem more ordinary jurist than usual. In fact, of course, he is a central figure and quite an appalling one as a person and as a jurist. At the time, what did the West recognize about this and about his role in the murderous farce? A second question, Herzen visited the courtroom in Nuremberg, was astounded by the small size of the courtroom, and the question, of course, is why it was chosen. Is it because of the repulsive Nazi rallies there, or because of its relatively undamaged state? And final questions by Michael Herzen. Regards one of his professors at Berkeley, Ryzanovsky, was the son of a prominent Imperial Russian jurist. And the question is, what happened to all this tradition? Was it truly forgotten at the time of Nuremberg, or was this just a pretense? So let's start with these three questions.
Well, and the last one was what forgotten at the time?
Yeah, the question was all this tradition, this tradition of prominent development in Russian legal traditions on the way to the revolution. Was it truly forgotten by the time of Nuremberg, or was this just pretense? Okay.
Thank you. Those are such amazing questions. Okay, so first of all, in terms of Vyshinsky, of course, yes, Vyshinsky is for those of you who don't know the history of Vyshinsky and Russian history, Vyshinsky has quite a history. I mean, he was involved again in the Stalinist show trials and show trials earlier. He's involved in all kinds of repressions in the Soviet Union and then abroad. In terms of what the Western powers knew about Vyshinsky, they mostly knew they knew he had been the chief prosecutor in the Moscow trials. Some of them understand that these Moscow trials were show trials. Some of them did not have a full understanding of what the Moscow trials were. They also knew that he was they saw him as one of the most prominent Soviet legal figures. And there's some, looking at the Western documents about Nuremberg, before the trial started, before they knew that who was going to be, if it was going to be Nikitchenko or Rudenko, there was speculation, actually. They thought that they might send Vyshinsky rather to be the Soviet chief prosecutor. So they anticipated that he might play some kind of a role, but I don't think they knew the depth of what he had been involved with. In terms of why Nuremberg, because this is a really big thing, and I spent some time talking about this in the book, the Soviets had wanted the trials to take place in Berlin. The Americans very strongly wanted the trials to take place in Nuremberg, in the American zone. And the Americans initially, they end up footing the initial cost of the trials, right? And and they're in charge of the initial logistics. But that wasn't clear that was going to be the case. But in part of the initial deliberations and negotiations, the Soviets give in on this point. They agree to hold it in Nuremberg. And my sense of part of why they give in is because of a realization about how expensive it's going to be and the logistics involved. And the agreement is that Berlin actually is chosen as the permanent seat of the International Military Tribunal. And the very first meetings of the tribunal are held in Berlin in October of 1945, when they take the indictment and they make a lot of decisions about what's going to happen in Nuremberg. It's also thought that there will be multiple trials initially, that there'll be multiple four-power trials, and that Nuremberg will then just be the site of the first one. But yes, in terms of the significance of Nuremberg itself as a place, I think that there are all of these pragmatic reasons and political reasons. But when Jackson made the argument for Nuremberg and why Nuremberg, it was because it was the home of the birth of Nazism. It was the site of the Nuremberg rallies. So that was definitely something that was talked about as part of that argument. In terms of Russian legal traditions, I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, but I'm happy to. But what you're asking is that, again, in terms of when we think about Russian law, I'm talking in part here about the show trial tradition, right? We have Rudenko, we have Nikitchenko. But the other part of that is someone like Aaron Trainin, who had received this earlier, more European legal training. Trainin had studied in the West. He had studied in Berlin. He had been to Austria. He knew many, many languages. He knew lots about international law and other countries' laws. And that's part of why he ends up being sent to Nuremberg, because he's sort of the Soviet Union's face to the West. Like, they understand that he's the person who can talk the language of law that the other representatives understand. And because that's very important, especially at the London conference, when there's all kinds of negotiations going on.
Thank you, Fran. And several other questions we lumped together. Beth Van Schack, who writes, as you know from my review, I love this book. One area I would like to know more about was the Soviet approach to crimes against humanity, another legal innovation of the Nuremberg era. And Alex Steiner has two questions. One is, were the trial proceedings covered in the Soviet press? What was the Soviet public opinion or popular sentiments on the outcome? And another question by Alex, just a second, I'm scrolling down. I would have loved to hear more about the Soviet effort to pin the Katina massacre on the Germans. How did they plan to present their case or provide evidence? At the time of the trials, did other Allied nations know anything about what happened in Katyn, or was this the first time that they heard about this matter?
Oh, these are all such amazing questions. I could spend like a whole afternoon talking about them because they're so rich. There's so much to talk about. Let me so quickly in terms of the Soviet press coverage. So the Soviet press coverage, it's really, I mean, to me, that was really interesting. Again, what the Soviet correspondents in Nuremberg had to say about, they thought the American press coverage was completely sensationalist, right? So the Soviet press coverage, the way that it worked was it would be like a transcript was taken of the trial, and then Pravda and Izvestia would publish. Now, it wouldn't be a full transcript. It would be a partial transcript of the parts that were censored in, right? And the coverage during the prosecution's case was much more extensive, not surprisingly, than the coverage during the defense case. During the defense case, very little was covered, right? They didn't think they should, right, publish what the defendants had to say in their defense. So during the days of the defense case, Pravda and Izvestia, they would run articles saying like Goering gave his usual fascist statements, or there was just like the usual propaganda, right? And they would kind of let it go with that, but then they'd have a big recap of Rudenko's speech and they would kind of go into it again. There would also be kind of these major stories about some of the defendants, again, but usually accompanied by these caricatures done by people like Boris Efimov, then the Kukrinitsi, these other caricaturists. So that was part of the coverage. In terms of what people thought, that's a very difficult question, right? Because we don't have full information about what people thought in the Soviet Union right at that particular time. We know we have reports from the secret police, right? So we have these kinds of reports saying that people were very upset about the verdicts. And we have all of these reports that were compiled and then that are like in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, again, talking about how people were upset about the verdicts in the different countries of Eastern Europe and demonstrations that were planned. But I feel like that someone would really need to research that much more in depth. And it's a very tricky question, again, because reception is something that's very difficult to get at during this time when there's such censorship. This question of what the Soviets thought about crimes against humanity, that's such a great question. And of course, the historian Peter Kolquist, one of our colleagues, is writing a book about the history of Soviet international law and spends a lot of time talking about the development of the idea of crimes against humanity in the imperial period. And for Trainin and others, when they're talking about Nazi crimes, and there's also, I should say that the historian Michelle Penn, there's a dissertation about Trainin that talks a little bit about this too. So when they're talking about crimes, again, it's crimes against peaceful Soviet citizens. So that, and crimes against peaceful citizens, that's kind of the language that they use for crimes against humanity. And so that's when the Soviets present their evidence on crimes against humanity in the courtroom, it's crimes against peaceful citizens. So this language of crimes against humanity, it gets put in, but I should say that early on in the London conference, when the deliberations are happening about how to define atrocities, the French also used the language of crimes against peaceful civilians. And so crimes against humanity is sort of another one of those kind of late adjustments. Katina, let me just talk about that for a second. Let me a little bit more water. The Katina story is incredibly important. And it's one of the most important moments, I think, in the Nuremberg trials in terms of thinking about the relationship among the four countries of the prosecution. So, and there's a lot of questions about who knew what when, not even among the Americans and the British, right? So maybe American intelligence knew something, but did the American representatives in Nuremberg know? And at what point did they know? And which members of the Soviet delegation knew about Katina? Some of them did, and some of them didn't. And so part of what I tried to piece together was, again, this question of who had access to what information, right? The Soviets have a secret Katina commission. Aaron Trainin is on it. One of the other assistant prosecutors is on it. So we knew that they, at a certain point, knew the full story, but it's not clear exactly who knew what full story. Katina comes up at Nuremberg in the indictment. So just to kind of recap, this was a crime that the Soviets had committed. The Germans had found the mass graves when they occupied the territory. They blamed it on the Soviets blamed it on the Germans. It became a big political hot potato. And then after the Nazi defeat, the Soviets were like, okay, well, they're defeated now. Now we can squarely place the blame on them. And we know from secret documents that the Soviets were thinking of holding their own separate trial for Katina. And then I think someone in the security apparatus had the idea of just including this in Nuremberg. Why not? And so it gets included. Again, there's the indictment is one of those documents. I was able to see the markups and the back and forth and the notations that were made by members of the security apparatus too. And it kind of went through a whole round robin. So Katina is, initially it's added as 900, the murder of 900 people. And then at a certain point, it gets changed into the murder of over 10,000 people, right? And the Soviets are insisting that this has to be in the indictment as a German war crime. Now, the Americans and the British and the French, they don't like this at all. And there's these deliberations about the indictment, they think that this is trouble. And they try to convince Rudenko to back down, that they're like, no matter who committed this, like, is there really compelling enough evidence? Do you really want to raise this in court? And Rudenko tells them that I have no choice. My hands are tied. If you don't want this in there, I have to go back to Moscow and talk to Stalin, and this is going to take a few weeks. And the Americans and the Jackson at that point is like, okay, we're just going to go ahead and it's going to go in there. So the indictment gets published. 2 days after the indictment gets published, Jackson gets secret intelligence telling him that, yeah, the Soviets probably did it. It looks like the Soviets did it. We have more conclusive evidence now that the Soviets did it. Can you have Rudenko maybe not bring it up again? And of course, that's not going to happen. And so it stays in there. And then in February, as part of the Soviets presenting their case, Yuri Prokofsky, the Soviet deputy chief prosecutor, he presents evidence on Katina as part of the Soviet presentations on Soviet war crimes. And that includes lots of fabricated evidence that the Soviets have fabricated. And so it's a big stain. But I think the thing to remember about Katina is that in the end, right, it's not included in the judgment. So I think this is one of these examples where the judges, right, the Western judges, they made sure that this did not go through. And so I think that's kind of one of those victories for justice in that case. Of course, the Nuremberg trials was not meant to try, it was only meant to try European Axis crimes. So there wasn't going to be a chance of trying any of the Allied powers for crimes that they had committed. But it does not then get blamed in the end on the Germans.
Thank you. Let's move to another set of questions. Next one by Thomas Walters, who asked, how much was the US poster on proceeding the trial was based on the influence of the US military that prosecuted the war? Another question by Daniel Snyder. Wonderful presentation, he writes. Have you looked at the Soviet participation in the Tokyo War Crime Tribunal, as well as their own trials of the Japanese in Khabarovsk? How does it compare with what they did in Nuremberg? And the third question by Astrid Hedin from Sweden. Thanks for excellent book. Have you presented the book yet at research institutions in post-communist countries?
I think those are all, thank you for those questions. I have not presented the book yet in anywhere except for, well, I presented it like by Zoom in Germany, but I have not presented. At some point it would be interesting to present it in Russia. I wonder, again, that's part of what I talked about at the end, like how it would be received, because it's on the one hand, it puts the Soviets back into the story, right? But it also spends a lot of time talking about Katina and the secret protocols, and I think is pretty clear-eyed, not just about the Soviet contribution, but also about Soviet war crimes and crimes against peace. And so I haven't, but at some point, more than even presenting it, I just look forward to having conversations with colleagues in Russia and seeing what they think about it. In terms of the Tokyo trials, the Tokyo Tribunal, I have not looked into this in depth, except that there's a little bit of continuity in personnel. And so Konstantin Gorshinin, who was a member of the secret commission, who spent a lot of time in Nuremberg, also has a role in the Tokyo trial. There's another Soviet assistant prosecutor who also has a role in the Tokyo trial. But there's a scholar, Valentina Polonina, who is in the middle of writing a book on the Tokyo war crimes trials. And she has a chapter in it about Khabarovsk, and I've seen the manuscript, so I think that's something for us all to look forward to. In terms of the US military, the influence of the US military, I mean, I think, again, the international, it was a military tribunal, right? And so in this sense, and part of that's, and so the militaries, all of the militaries are involved, right? In that sense. Part of, I should just say, part of why they decide that it should be a military tribunal is because there's more flexibility about the kinds of setup, about the framework, about the rules that will be put in place. And so that is indeed an early consideration. They talk about the trial as a continuation of the war effort in that particular way. In terms of US military personnel, which is like a different angle on this, so that's one of the things that comes up like all over the place in small ways too in the book, where because again, the Americans have control over the Nuremberg prison. It's the US authorities who are in charge of the defendants and in charge of the witnesses. And this plays out in all kinds of ways. Early on, once the Soviets get to Nuremberg, they want to be able to interview the defendants and the witnesses on their own. They're not allowed to. There has to be someone, the Americans insist that there has to be someone in the room. And so there's always an American stenographer in there. There are other ways too. I mean, the Soviets, there are certain points at which they resent the Americans and the presence of all this military personnel. They talk about all of the American military personnel in the courtroom. And Vishnevsky, who writes these very interesting letters home about just like what's happening in Nuremberg and his feelings about everything. And he talks about just how he makes him so angry how going to the courtroom and seeing all of these American officers who are chewing gum, right? They're chewing gum in the courtroom. And they're chewing gum while they're talking about the blood of the Russians. And so again, I think that's something, there's lots of military personnel there, but the American personnel in abundance.
Thank you. Another set of questions. Claudia Periswana asked, what did the Nuremberg trials aftermath provided that differs from previous Geneva Conventions agreements? Claude Ezran asked, who was acquitted and why? Thomas Spitters asked, please offer your comments on a good number of Waffen-SS from Eastern Europe, in some cases, and not just from Central Europe, and why this was not strictly and conspicuously addressed at the trial.
Okay, lots of different questions from all over the place. So, so the SS. So I guess I'm not sure in terms of like why, like the SS, it was addressed at the trial, and there was lots of evidence that was presented about the Waffen-SS as well. So there was, in fact, part of the trial. You had the prosecution's case, and then the defense case, which really goes on for quite a long time. And then there's the organizations case, where they do try all of these organizations, and as part of the trial of the SS, the Waffen-SS, they are in fact tried, and there's all kinds of evidence that is brought in, and they're declared to be a criminal organization, although certain branches of the SS escape the ultimate criminality charge. And I'd have to go back to my notes to kind of remember the details of how that itself plays out. But there is all kinds of discussion about the crimes of all of the branches of the SS that it's part of the trial itself. In terms of the acquittal, so there's 3 acquittals. Schacht, who's the financial minister, von Papen, and Fritzsche, who is the kind of the propaganda minister. And this is the interesting thing in terms of what did it take for there to be an acquittal, right? In the Soviet justice system, you're assumed guilty. Right? For the trial, they're assumed innocent. And what they said for a number of these is that the prosecution didn't sufficiently make the case on any of the particular charges. And I should just add that part of what happens, so there's 4 main categories of charges in the indictment. Conspiracy, and that's a charge that gets added at Jackson's initiative. Conspiracy, war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. And conspiracy is added as a way of trying to prove everyone's guilt. Different defendants are charged under, they're not all charged under all four of them, but they're all charged under conspiracy. And in the end, the conspiracy is the one charge that the judges prove to be not all that impressed with. And so the judges end up circumscribing the conspiracy charge only to the conspiracy to prepare and wage aggressive war. And so any conspiracy for war crimes, conspiracy for crimes against peace, conspiracy for crimes against humanity, that then kind of gets dismissed. And so a number of the people who had been charged with conspiracy, they get off on that crime. I think that the Fritzsche one, the question of incitement, right? Incitement to violence, is really interesting, because what they basically say in the end is that they can't prove that he had actually incited people to violence with his radio programs, with his propaganda, with his announcements. And that's one of the reasons that he's off. The Soviets, by the way, are furious about all of this. And one of the interesting things about the judgment, that document, that again, so they send a draft judgment. Nikitchenko sends a draft judgment while they're still working on it. And it's clear at that point that there's going to be some acquittals. And Moscow sends these very detailed directives about like why you should insist that they're all guilty, and you know, he's not able to make the case. There was another question about in terms of I'm not sure what the question, what you're asking, and I wish we could have this back and forth so you could ask for further explanation. But the difference from Nuremberg in terms of how it differed from earlier war crimes trials, right, is that earlier war crimes conventions were primarily concerned with what we would consider to be the more traditional war crimes. And this idea of crimes against peace, the idea of war guilt, like that you're guilty for waging an aggressive war, that was one of the main innovations of Nuremberg. And again, we can call it an innovation or we can call it a travesty, depending on our opinion about it. Some people thought that, again, this was ex post facto retroactive law. But the fact was that along with this concept of crimes against humanity, which had been used before, but I think it's at Nuremberg that it really gains its teeth. So those are some of the things that come out of the trial, along also with genocide. These ideals that get talked about as the Nuremberg principles, that again include crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, genocide, that's part of the legal innovation that happens at Nuremberg.
Thank you. Let's move to another set, and the next one is by Lucas Beisner. Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. Could you describe how the daily life and political conversations of the Soviet delegations with their Western counterpart at Nuremberg affected their relationship with the political elite back in the Soviet Union upon returning home? Antonia Four asked, does your book respond to a discussion about the Soviet role and the involvement in the Nuremberg trials? Has your book been reviewed in Russia, and what was the reception? And the third question that we'll have by now, Ilana Braun, why were there also the national trials? Why were not all done by the international military tribunals? This is the question. Why were there also the national trials were not all done by the International Military Tribunal?
Okay, so I think that the last question, I think that what you're asking is, so you have, there's part of the Moscow Declaration, some of these agreements after the war, they differentiate between, so the International Military Tribunal is going to deal with the crimes of the quote unquote major war criminals and the organizations. And then the idea is that part of these trials of the organizations are meant to pave the way to further war crimes trials of the members of the organizations. And it's agreed that those trials are going to happen nationally, that people will hold, that the nations will hold their own trials of whether it's SS members or military members, they thought, right, that are convicted, and that the Nuremberg is supposed to kind of open the way and give the legal precedent to that. That's part of what the organization's case was supposed to do, right? So the four major powers and other countries that are holding trials before Nuremberg. The IMT is the one that's meant to be kind of the big trial, again, because to deal with crimes that were not committed in one country. It's an international military tribunal to deal in part with crimes that are seen as international in nature. And so it's a coming together of the nations. So that's part of what that differentiation is in terms of the different kinds of trials that are going to be held. In terms of my book, so far as I know, my book has not been reviewed yet in Russia. And so again, I'm eager to see what kind of reception it has there. There's been some excellent research that's been done by scholars in Russia. There are some amazing document collections by scholars like Natalia Lebedeva and Alexander Zvigintsev, and who have also then with those documents kind of put together a narrative of some of the events in Nuremberg. And so that's been wonderful. And I would love to have a conversation with them at some point about their research and my research. I would truly welcome that. There's also work by Russian scholars like Marina Sorokina, who've worked on the Extraordinary State Commission. And Marina was very kind to me when I was doing my research in Moscow, and then we're in touch. So again, but in terms of the book itself, yeah, that not yet, and we'll see, I guess. In terms of the daily, so there's two sets of interesting questions in terms of daily life and those relationships, and then what happens when they go back home. So in terms of what happens when they go back home, let me start there. So the judge Nikachenko, he gets all caught up he's tried. He's part of like, there's a whole big judge's trial, and he's one of the people who's the accused in the judge's trial for corruption. And so, and one of the things that's against him, and James Heinsohn has written a book about some of these trials, and I know some of this from his research that he shared with me, that one of the charges against him is that he had some kind of relationship with a German woman. So that's kind of interesting, and that's all I know about that. Roman Rudenko, he ends up doing really well. He ends up becoming the kind of the state prosecutor in the Soviet Union afterwards, taking over a position that Vyshinsky had earlier held. And so he survives. Aaron Trainin, things do not go very well for him after he goes home. And see, not necessarily because of the back and forth on any relationships that were formed, but because the Soviet Union launches an anti-cosmopolitan campaign, anti-Semitic campaign. And by 1948, that's really rolling. And so Trainin and certain other members of the Soviet delegation, Soviet cultural figures, members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Commission, they run into tremendous difficulties. Some cultural figures, some of them are shot, there are arrests. Trainin himself is arrested, he's arrested, he's let go, but his life is never the same afterwards. And so again, this is the thing about thinking about this period of Soviet history. This period of the war and the Nuremberg trials is this moment where the Soviets are taking a more kind of universalist approach to law, and they're, for need and whatever other reasons, right, they're collaborating with Western allies. That really shifts by the end of 1946. Soviet scholars have talked about the Zhdanovshchina, the anti-Western campaign. And so it's not necessarily even about those particular personal relationships, but people who had spent time abroad are once again, right, this had happened before, and once again seen as suspect and get into trouble because of it.
Thank you. And we'll have another bunch of questions. Francis Kruzhensky asked, how was the murder of the Jews by the Germans covered by the Soviet press? Jasmine Alexander Green asked, I'm curious about the research phase of your project. You drew sources from multiple archives across the former Soviet space, including the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You also mentioned that present-day Russia has developed its own simplified narrative of the Nuremberg trials. While conducting research for this book, did you ever feel that your access to archival documents was being manipulated in an attempt to shape your own narrative or support local ones? What challenges did you encounter during this quest for information. And the third question by Alina Bikova. A wonderful presentation. What was the impact of the Nuremberg trials on the development of international law in the 20th century?
These are, so the Nuremberg trials on the development. Okay, these are, I can spend, like, how many hours do we have? These are such amazing questions. I'm so much fun having all of this to think about. So in terms of the Soviet press and their and there are scholars who have studied this in much more depth than I have. You know, the David Schneer's work, and just a whole number of scholars who've really looked in detail again at the portrayal of the Holocaust, right, in the Soviet press. And from a lot of what I know is some of what I know from what they've written, but some of what I know from reading some of the coverage, especially some of the coverage from Ilya Ehrenberg at the time and others. And so what I would say is, again, the official Soviet narrative in the press before Nuremberg, it matched the narrative in the trials, where the emphasis was much more on crimes against peaceful Soviet citizens. But, and this is a really big but, at the same time, there were discussions of the crimes against the Jews that were in the newspapers themselves. And so if you read a discussion of the Kharkov trial, there would be talk about the crimes against peaceful Soviet citizens, but then there'd be a few lines in the newspaper coverage that actually really specified particular crimes against the Jews. So again, there are these narratives that were coexisting. Right? They talked about the crimes against the Jews, the murder of the Jews, the extermination of the Jews, at the same time as they talked about this as the murder of the Jews and the crimes against peaceful Soviet citizens as a whole. So these are simultaneous narratives, is what I would say. What I would also say is that early on, I'm trying to remember now, I think it's early, if it's December 42, whenever it is at the Allied Nations after the St. James Conference, and they kind of come out with these proclamations about how like something needs to be done, that tens or hundreds of thousands of Jews have been murdered. The Soviets actually come out with their own statement at that time, talking explicitly about the murder of the Jews in much more explicit and graphic terms than any of the Western powers do. And I talk about this in the book, that they're actually out there like even earlier, and because they're getting all kinds of reports from the secret police, and at a certain point they decide to go public with some of it. It's vague, but it's in there, and again, it's specific, the crimes against the Jews. So that's it's interesting, and again, there's some really interesting work that's been done on this by other scholars. Okay, so there was the research. I could talk about the research forever, so you might have to stop me on this. So I did research in 5 different archives. The archive of the Academy of Sciences was just, delightful. And what I was looking for there was that I knew from the work of other scholars too, like George Ginsburg's, that about that Aaron Trainin had had a role in kind of the London conference and all of this. But I had very nice access to be able to look at those early transcripts. I began doing the research too, also in the State Archive of the Russian Federation in Garf. And I should say too that I did the research in 2005 and 2006. So it was a very different Russia at that point, I think, in terms of archival access. Things were much more open then than they are now. So the work that I did in the State Archive, kind of in the main reading room, you have access to FON 7445, which is the official Nuremberg trials collection, where you have all the official documents having to do with the trials, but like there's some other really interesting documents snuck in there. Like there are some amazing surveillance reports and other kinds of things that were super interesting. But then there's another like a secret archival FON, the secret archival collection that I was able to get access to there to see some of the more behind the scenes materials that were in the State Archive that had to do with Rudenko and the members of the Soviet security apparatus and Vyshinsky's commission and all of that. And I should say that that particular archival fund, 8131, is now closed. So you can't get in there now. So my timing was really good, just 2005, 2006. The other archives I worked in, so the Party Archive, and again, like the Stalin Fund had just, like, archival materials were just starting to be released. And the State Archive of Literature and Art, which was another amazing place, where, again, Roman Carmen's diaries and letters and Vsevolod Vishnevsky's letters, and there were photos there. And some of that really gave me just like a sense of the human part of things, right? And then the best, well, I shouldn't say the best, but the most exciting in terms of getting access, I'll say for last, and that was the Foreign Ministry Archive. And that was very hard to get access to. I had to be very persistent and keep asking and keep asking and keep asking. And finally, one day they said yes. And they said, you never know these things. They said yes, I think it was 3 days before I had my plane ticket to go home. And so I called the airline and changed my plane ticket and was able to stay and really take advantage of that. And again, at that particular time, there was a Russian scholar, Natalia Lebedeva, who was also working in there on some days. Yeah, this question of, again, like what do you get access to? What don't you get access to? Do you, like, are they giving you all the materials or some of the materials? The beautiful thing about working in a whole bunch of different archives and about things not always even being organized in the most sensible ways, about finding surveillance reports where you don't think you're going to find them even, is that you're able to, what historians do is, like, we kind of triangulate. We use lots of different sources to try to put together a picture and read those sources against each other. And what we're trying to do is put together multiple perspectives and get as close to what happened as we can. But yeah, there are some, I mean, there are some stuff I'd still love to be able to see. I don't know, for example, like who said what to whom, like how exactly did Katina disappear from the judgment, right? I know it disappeared, but like what was going on behind the scenes? There are things I would love to know about what was happening with the Soviet security apparatus. There's a murder in Nuremberg. One of the Soviet assistant prosecutors, well, they call it a suicide, could be suicide, could be murder, but like that, maybe there's documents somewhere. I didn't get to see those. Stalin's secret thoughts. No, if he jotted them down, who knows? Anyway, so I'll stop because again, I can just get me started on archives and I'll never end. But the other great question was about, the influence on international law. And again, I would say that yes, I mean, I think that Nuremberg had an absolutely fundamental influence on international law in terms of these Nuremberg principles. And so the principles themselves are sort of ratified, even though the effort initially to turn them into a permanent international law code, it stumbles and stops, and it's only later that we have the International Criminal Court. But I do think that the origins of some current day international law comes from Nuremberg. So Beth Van Schaik, who's in the audience, actually could talk about this even more than I could. So should put her on the spot. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. There is one last question by Thomas Peter following up his previous question. Thank you for answering his earlier ones. And that is, if you could say a little bit more about the role of non-Russians or domestic domestic collaborators inside the Soviet Union who helped the Nazis. Were they addressed in the trials, and what was the Soviet approach to this very delicate issue?
Yeah, this is a tricky question. And I should say that there were trials of domestic collaborators, some of them even before the Nuremberg trials, right? And then there were many trials of domestic collaborators afterwards. The tricky things about the trials that happened afterwards, not just in the Soviet Union, but throughout Eastern Europe, is that sometimes it's hard to know exactly whether someone was a collaborator or whether they're being targeted for political reasons. So there are other scholars who are doing that really close work of looking at those documents and trying to make sense of things and those particular trials. And those are the scholars whose work that I rely on. And I'm getting tired, otherwise I would list off a whole bunch of names, but yes, but thank goodness that there are so many people doing wonderful work to help answer these really big, important questions.
With this, we'll end the questions and answer. I will just remind that there will be a recording posted on our website in a few days, so people will be able to, and then again, to enjoy this wonderful, wonderful presentation. The book is out, available in many servers, Amazon, and all others.
Here's the cover. It is nice and
And
red, so you don't
there
miss
it is, that you know that it really exists. Thanks so much, Fran, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. And thank you everyone for your great questions.
Yeah, if you could stay a little bit. Yeah.
Sure.